Well, good afternoon, folks. Happy New Year, one and all. Today, we're going to be talking about navigation in the age of sail. This is a kind of big topic to be covered in an hour or less. So really what I'm going to be talking about is the way people found their way aboard ships in the first half of the period of European exploration, let's say from the middle 1400s to the middle 1700s or 1600s. But I'm going to talk about a little bit of everything, how it is that sailors were able to find their way from very early times, how it was that they were able to figure out how to use things that appeared in the sky to find out where they were and figure out where they were going. So let's get started. Let's talk about what is navigation. Well, navigation, as it says here, is the art of guiding a ship or a boat, and later airplanes, and these days cars, from one place to another. And it involves three basic questions. First, if I'm going to navigate, I need to know, where am I? Where am I right now? Where am I starting from? Where do I want to go? How far is it? What direction is it in? And then, I don't necessarily want to go in a straight line. What's the most advantageous way? When we're talking about traveling in the sea, we may want to avoid contrary winds or currents. We may, if we're in a military situation, be involved with the stealthiest approach. So in any case, I need to figure out not only where am I, and where do I want to get to, but what particular course do I want to follow to get there? And navigation is as old as the use of boats. Once a person got in a boat, he had to figure out where he was going, and how to get back. So let's start with, how old are boats? Well, we really have no idea. The oldest boat that's ever been discovered is the Passy canoe from the Netherlands, which is right around 10,000 years old. It's about 10 feet long. It's a dugout canoe. Similar canoes that size and larger have been found on probably 4 different continents around the world, and similar age. So we know they've been around for 10,000 years, probably independently invented in a lot of different places, and probably well past before I should say, those 10,000 years ago. Other candidates for the first boats would be rafts made out of wood or bamboo. The Polynesians were certainly using these 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, when they first began spreading out across the Pacific Ocean. Or boats made of reeds, bundles of reeds from the marshes tied together. We have a picture on the bottom right of a reed boat from Kuwait from about 5,000 BC. Reed boats and rafts, if an archaeologist ever found one, they might not even know that that was what they found. So it's hard to say how far they go back. But again, we look at reeds, bamboo, wooden canoes. What people built probably depended on what they had available. But in any case, boats have certainly been around for a long time. For example, we know that the first human inhabitants of Australia got there about 40,000 years ago. They had to cross a bunch of water somehow. The first sailing vessels, well, we have evidence from Kuwait from about 5,000 BC, Taiwan, 4,000 BC, Egypt, 3,500 BC. And it could well be that just because that's the earliest evidence we have, that they were around much longer. But certainly when people first began to sail in sailing vessels, that enabled them to make longer voyages and gave them the possibility of getting much farther from home. So the first navigators, again, were pretty much the first people that got into boats. And the first form of navigation was piloting. And that's basically the use of visual landmarks to find your way. I'm going to get in my canoe and go down the river. As I go down, I'm going to notice what's along the shore. And when I turn around and head back home, I'm going to follow those landmarks until I see my familiar landing point on the beach. Venturing out farther out at sea, things like mountains, church steeples, whatever, certainly would have provided milestones for people to recognize points along the shore. Once people ventured outside of the sight of land, they had another problem. You couldn't see what was along the beach. They undoubtedly used basic celestial guideposts. It doesn't take much to figure out that the sun rises in one direction and sets in the other direction. That gives us a general reference for direction no matter where I am. Well, maybe the best evidence we have of what people did in very early days is to look at what the Polynesians did and do to this day without any fancy technology. Since about 5,000 years ago, they've been sailing from island to island in the Pacific, long distances, small targets. They find their way to an island, and once they found it, they find their way back home so that new colonists could go back to that island. What are they using? Well, they're using wave and wind patterns. They were very skillful observers of sea conditions, understood what patterns were caused by disturbances from land that might be out of sight, cloud formations. Clouds would form over tall mountainous islands. You'd see the big cumulus clouds on the horizon long before you'd see the island. Bird flight pattern, birds that nest ashore when they're out of sight of land, eventually they're gonna have to fly back to land. So they could follow those. There are some reports that they would carry a frigate bird in a cage and at a certain point release it. And if it didn't come back to their canoe, they would know that the direction it flew was the direction of land. But perhaps most intriguing, celestial observations. They basically developed a compass which was passed on through oral tradition, which involved knowing the rising and setting points on the horizon of a number of stars, including the sun. But by being able to memorize that, they could have, as you see basically on the bottom left of the screen, an example laid out in the sand. They could look at the points of setting and rising of stars and know specifically in a relative circular position where those directions lay. We know that the Vikings settled Iceland and Greenland and visited the coast of North America well before the introduction of the magnetic compass in Europe. And they likely used skills comparable to the Polynesians, but they did have the additional problem of a lot of cloudy, snowy, foggy weather. There are Viking, shall we say, myths that they had sunstones that they could hold up on a cloudy day and it would somehow tell them where the sun was. These are more than mythological though, because there are a number of medieval church records which show that the churches held and valued sunstones. And scientists have concluded that possibly it was a form of crystal found in Iceland and in Scandinavia, which when held up had refractive qualities and would enable them to find, when they couldn't see the actual sun, they could find where the concentration of the sunlight was coming, whether through clouds or whether below the horizon. Experimenters have had mixed results with this, but it's very intriguing. And there was one British shipwreck from, I think it's 1591, where divers found in the wreckage one of these Icelandic crystals in a part of the wreckage right next to navigating equipment, which would suggest that there was some kind of truth to this and that it was known beyond just the Vikings. Well, what about using the stars as guides? The first thing that probably became apparent when people studied the stars, and people a long time ago had not much else to do, if you look at the night sky, you see the constellations such as Ursa Major, the Big Bear, and it would become apparent that these, while they kept their form, their relative position, they moved in the sky and they rotated around a central point. So here we see a photograph, a time-lapse photograph of the northern sky, and in the center is Polaris, the pole star, the North Star, and over time, all these other stars are moving around it. Once they figured this out, Polaris became a reference point for north. It doesn't move because it's directly overhead at the North Pole. The axis of the Earth's rotation points to it, so all the other stars appear to move around it as the Earth rotates. Now, Polaris is not perfect north. It's probably plus or minus about 1/2 degree. And over time, the Earth's axis wobbles. And so we have the precession of the Earth's axis. It's a very slow wobble, takes about 26,000 years. But during that wobble, periodically other stars take the center position. Polaris has been the North Star for about 1,500 years, will be for another 1,500 years or so. At various times, one of the other stars in Ursa Minor there has served as the pole star, changes perhaps every 1,000 or so years. But for now, and for past history and future purposes, 1,000, 1,500 years either way, Polaris is the North Star. So before the invention of the magnetic compass, just a basic sense of directions could be used as a guide to steering by keeping the North Star at a certain point on your orientation. Now this compass star, compass rose, I'll mention this right now, does not have degrees marked on it. You notice it has the 4 principal directions, northeast, southwest, and then we have northeast, southeast, southwest, so forth. And then those are divided further into east, northeast, east, southeast, so forth. And then there are lines in between those points that provide another 16 points, giving a total of 32 points of the compass. A sailor didn't have to read in order to be able to recognize this. He just had to memorize the 32 points. Again, starting northeast, southwest, and then northeast, southeast, southwest, and so forth, until you get down to the finest divisions, like the one immediately to the right of north would be north by east. And then we have northeast by east. And so we have a way of defining all of these things. And sailor had to memorize that compass. Well, when the magnetic compass comes along, it was invented in China, the principles of it at least probably 2,000 years ago or more, but they figured out how to use it for navigation around 1000 AD, and it's made its way to Europe by shortly before 1200. And after that, the magnetic compass was a huge aid to sailing because it allowed people to steer an accurate course regardless of whether they could see Polaris, cloudy, day, night, didn't matter. We see in this mounted compass, it's got a couple of rings, and those rings are fixed on the sides. And what this does, they're called gimbals, and this allows the compass to stay level no matter whether the ship is pitching or rolling. And that made it more accurate in its readings. We should note that the compass does not point to the true North Pole. It points to the magnetic North Pole, which differs from the North Pole and in fact changes over time. But for the purposes of a voyage or a series of voyages, it provided a consistent direction. Now, the compass is also useful to provide visual bearings to obtain a fix. This is a form of piloting, but we see here a map of the Bahamas, and we're somewhere in that blue circle there. We know, we can see the islands, but we're not sure exactly where we are, and we're in an area where there are hazards, there are reefs, there are shoals. We would like to know exactly where we are. What can I do? I can take my compass and I can line it up and see this headland that's down there on the bottom right, and I get a magnetic bearing. Looks like it's about, 165 degrees, and I can draw that line on my chart. I can take a second bearing on another headland or landmark, and I have an intersection now. That ought to be where I am, but to be sure, let's take a third line, and now I have a check on my accuracy, and I have a very precise position where I am. That's a very useful thing, especially when navigating close to land. When you think about it, the vast majority of maritime disasters have happened within sight of land. That's where the hazards are, the rocks, the shoals, the beaches. That's where the traffic is, lots of reasons. Now let's look at another use of Polaris. The idea of latitude sailing, of sailing east and west along a line of latitude, allowed early sailors to get from one place to another. All they needed to do was know the latitude they wanted to be at. Well, how did they do that? if I'm at a particular place to start with, I can figure out the latitude there. The Polynesians in the lower right, you see how the Polynesians would do it. The navigator would hold out his arm and he would measure the distance between his thumb and Polaris. He could memorize that position. If that's his home island, he now knows the latitude of his home island. On his way home, all he has to do is sail north or south till he has Polaris in the right position and then follow it home. On the right shows a nifty little gadget called the Kamal, which was an Arab invention. And this allows an even more precise measurement. The navigator would hold a string in his teeth and stretch it out to a certain point indicated by a knot. There'd be a little wooden panel there. And that, when stretched tight, if he lined up the bottom of it with the horizon and the top with the particular, oh, this is a French picture, étoile, the particular star he's looking at, he could have a duplicatable line of latitude. He could have multiple knots on his cord so that he could record the latitude of where he left from, his home, and he can record the latitude of his destination. And this, again, by sailing north or south to the latitude desired and then going east or west, allowed them to rather precisely get to where they needed to be. The skill of dead reckoning, dead for deduced, is almost as old as sailing. And this was a way of keeping track of where you are when you can't find out where you are. But we start with a position we know where we started, and that becomes a starting point on our chart. We record the estimated speed and direction of various legs of our journey. On the right is something called a traverse board, and the navigator, the helmsman on the ship, every half hour, the helmsman or the ship's boy would turn over the sand glass that kept time, and it would ring the bell. And at that point, he would take a little peg. On the bottom, there's a series of lines, 4 on each side, 8 lines for 8 half hours on a normal watch. He would put a peg on one of those horizontal lines indicating the speed for that half hour. And he would put a peg starting with the center ring of marks around the compass rose and working outward each half hour. He would put a peg in there indicating his direction. Now, what this did is at the end of 4 hours, the navigator could take a look at this board, record the speed and direction for every half hour, and come up with a composite indication of where we have gone. Well, how do we figure out the speed? The first item that was used was simply a chip of wood. The navigator would go to a marked spot on the side of the ship, drop the chip of wood in the water, and then he would chant a chant until the chip passed a second marked point, a known distance between them. He would keep track of the syllables, and he would know what syllable he was on when he was chanting when the chip passed the second mark, and that would give him a time and distance from which he could deduce the speed. This got refined in later years into what was called the chip log, shown in the picture on the bottom right. It's basically a spool with several hundred feet of rope on it. On the end of it, there's a weighted piece of wood, which when thrown in the water would float vertically and more or less keep its position as the ship moved away. And what would happen is the person operating the chip log would drop that into the water and state the time that happened. Somebody else would start a small sand glass that might have maybe a 30-second timer. And at the end of 30 seconds, he would state that the time was done. The person with the spool would grab the rope, and then he would pull it back in, counting the number of knots on the rope. For a 30-second timer, if I have a knot every 50 feet, every knot represents, as you can see by this jumble of calculations, every knot on the rope represents 1 nautical mile per hour. So by counting the knots at the end of the evolution, he will record our speed at this time is 4 knots. And that's how the term knots became the term that's used for nautical miles per hour. He didn't have to know any of that. All he had to do was be able to count to 3 or 4 or 5 and put the peg in the right hole on the board. By putting the time and speed together, the navigator can then record these on a chart. Here we have a series of half-hour speeds, and by putting this on a chart, we can see the star on the left and the star on the right, regardless of where all the little lines in between went. that should indicate where we are. If we knew where we were when we started, later in our voyage, we have a position in reference to that. Columbus relied very heavily on dead reckoning. He was quite frankly not a very good celestial navigator. He had a couple of instruments with him, as we'll see in a few minutes, but he was not good at using them. His positions that he obtained were as much as 20 degrees off in calculating latitude, so it was virtually worthless. But he was an extremely good dead reckoner. On his first voyage home, he left Samana Bay in Hispaniola. He made his way all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and made his intended landfall at Santa Maria Island in the Azores, pretty much by reversing his outbound track. This could be a very accurate or quite accurate system. There are some problems with dead reckoning because it's quite easy for it to be inaccurate. Very famous case in 1707, British admiral with the lovely name of Sir Cloudesley SHOVELL or SHOVELL, I think it's better if we call him Shovel though, relied on some very bad dead reckoning and ended up leading his fleets onto the rocks of the Scilly Islands on a foggy night. He managed to lose 4 ships, over 1,500 sailors, and probably just as good for himself, he also lost his own life. But again, dead reckoning has to be used with caution because it's not an exact position. Well, this brings us kind of to celestial navigation. This is kind of fun. The earliest written documentation for the use of celestial navigation appears in the Iliad, about 600 BC, when Calypso instructs Odysseus to find his way home, to keep the constellation Ursa Major on his left side, the port side, and she provided some other guidance. And we have this quote, "Nor did sleep ever descend on his eyelids as he kept his eye on the Pleiades, another constellation, and late setting Boötes, and the Bear," which is Ursa Major, "whom men also give the name of the wagon, who turns about in a fixed place and looks at Orion." You recall I pointed out that Ursa Major moves through the night all around the North Star. So this is a pretty good indication that they had a very good sense of stars that could be used to guide them on their way. So Polaris can indicate direction. We know that, it's north. It's pretty easy to find. We see the Big Dipper on the left here and the 2 stars, Dubhe and Merak, which line up and provide a pointer to Polaris. And if you kind of do a little finger marking in the sky, it's about 4 times the distance, the length of that end of the big distance to go from Dubhe to Polaris. So it's very easy to find Polaris in the North Star. I'm sorry, in the northern sky. I recall one time when I was visiting a friend who lives near Lake Anna, sort of in the middle of nowhere in Virginia, in the time, very early ages of GPS, and when cell phones weren't very good. I left his house about 2 in the morning to come home to Hampton Roads. And he told me, you go down this road about 2 miles, you turn left on whatever road, and you go about 3 miles to the T-shaped intersection, and you turn right and so forth to get me back to Interstate 64, which was all well and good, but after a while of driving in the middle of nowhere, it didn't seem to be lining up with his directions. So what I did was I pulled over in a clearing in the woods. There was a cornfield. I walked out in the field. I found Polaris. I determined what direction was north. And I figured out that if I went in the opposite direction, south, I was sooner or later going to bump into Interstate 64. And in fact, actually, truth is, I think I was heading, doesn't matter, senile old person here, but I figured out where north was and used that to guide myself. And in a few miles, indeed, I bumped into the interstate because I knew what direction I needed to go. But now, how can we use the North Star to measure not just direction, but to find our latitude? It's actually quite simple. If we look at the Earth, here's the Earth, and on the bottom where it says S, the South Pole, if I were to stand there, I could not see Polaris because, as we said, it's directly overhead at the North Pole. So to see Polaris, I'd have to actually walk halfway around the Earth until I got to the equator. And at that point, Polaris would appear right on the horizon. And the angle between Polaris and the horizon would be 0 degrees. Guess what? The latitude of the equator is 0 degrees. If I were to go then to the North Pole, I would find that the North Star, Polaris, is directly overhead. The angle between Polaris and the horizon makes a 90-degree angle. 90 degrees north is the latitude of the North Pole. Halfway in between, at 45 degrees north, I'm going to find that the angle to Polaris is 45 degrees. No matter where I am, if I see Polaris, if I can measure its altitude, its angle against the horizon, I can get a direct measurement of my latitude. It's that simple. You can make a little instrument for yourself. Here's a plastic protractor with a straw taped on it to look through and line things up, a little weight hanging on it. And you line up with Polaris and you take a measurement. It's not quite that simple because this protractor happens to be upside down, so I'm going to have to use a complementary angle. Basically, I'm going to have to subtract what I get from 90, but something you can make yourself and find your latitude, very simple. Over time, navigators came up with a series of tools to make this process possible. The Mariner's astrolabe in 1430 was the first really good tool for measuring altitude of heavenly bodies at sea. And this was followed by the quadrant, the cross staff, the back staff, and then another 150 years later or so, we have the development of the octant and the sextant. Let's take a quick look at these various things. The astrolabe was actually invented by the Greeks. On the right is a fascinating implement recovered from a shipwreck about 100 years ago. The Antikythera, did I leave in the right number of syllables there? Yeah, let's see. Let's find that. I don't know. The Antikythera, I think, mechanism, but it was basically something, a calculator, mechanical calculator that could be used to determine the movement of the planets, figure out the time and direction of sunrise and sunset, and a number of other things. Extraordinarily complex. The Greeks were very good astronomers. Well, the Arabs recovered and refined this concept around the 9th century AD. On the bottom left, we see an Arab astrolabe. We see it deconstructed on the right. It had a series of plates. I could put one of those on and keep the rest for different purposes. They were used for different purposes. I would put a plate on. I would then put that cover plate on the bottom center. And then I would put the vane, which is on the left, on it. That could turn. And I could look through a little hole on either end of that, line it up at a star, measure where that star was. I could do a lot of things with this. But this was a lot more complicated than was needed by the mariners. So the Portuguese, from the first half of the 15th century, the time of Prince Henry the Navigator, when the Portuguese were kind of mastering navigation at sea, the Mariner's astrolabe strips away all those unnecessary things and retains two things: the vane, which can turn, and the scale, which we see on the top. It's made out of heavy metal so that while the ship is rocking, it tends to hang straight and not move a lot. It's got holes in it so that the wind doesn't affect it excessively. So it provides a pretty steady measurement. To use this, on the right, we see someone holding the astrolabe, hanging it down. That gives it a vertical axis, and at right angles to that, we have, in effect, the angle of the horizon. And he can turn that vane looking through the two little holes until he sees what he's looking for, perhaps Polaris, and that will give an angular measurement of the altitude of Polaris in the sky. This could also be used to measure the angle of the sun in the sky, and we'll see why that's a little important. But rather than have to look through it at the sun, the mariner could hold it as it's shown on the left, hold it above the deck, kind of parallel to the shadows on the deck until he could line up the sun through the two little holes. And down by this man's right foot, you see a little star where there would be a little spot of sunlight on the deck. And then he could measure from that the altitude of the sun in the sky. The next development was the Mariner's quadrant, first documented use in navigation in 1461. We know that Columbus carried one of these. I was about to say he was familiar with it. Apparently he wasn't. He didn't use it very well. But this is a quadrant, a quarter of a circle, on the bottom edge marked in degrees, very simple. On the right edge, you see two little protrusions, each with a little hole in it for sighting the celestial body, and a string on the top, reconstructed on the bottom, where the weight would hang down, and that would show the angular measurement of the heavenly body. Simple, inexpensive, but it was affected by wind and the movement of the ship. That pendulum moved very easily. Quite frankly, even in a classroom situation, it's hard to use this accurately because of the free movement of that pendulum. Also, it kind of requires two people, one to keep the sighting correct and another to read the measurement. So some problems with that, but again, simple, cheap, easy to get. The cross staff solved a number of these problems, developed in the 14th century, first recorded use at sea, just a little after Columbus in 1514. And this consists of basically a fixed version of the Arab kamal. We have a long staff and we have a crossbar which can slide up and down by looking at the horizon and lining up one side of the cross staff with that, sliding it until he could see the star on the lined up with the other end of the cross staff. We have an angular measurement which will be marked on the staff. Typically, this might have had 2 or 3 different crossbars that could be used, a short one for measuring low angles in the sky, a long one for measuring high angles, but it did have some problems. You see this guy is holding it kind of close to his eye. Well, where he puts it on his face and in relation to his eye will affect the angular measurement, and this can be different for different people, so it's very user specific, some margin for error there. Also, he has to be able to focus on both the horizon and the star at the same time. Not particularly an easy task, although it's possible. But perhaps worst of all was if he wanted to use this to measure the angle to the sun, he has to look at the sun while he's lining it up with the vane. A significant number of navigators of this era had vision problems in typically their right eye, their dominant eye, from looking at the sun too much. That problem was solved by the backstaff, the Davis quadrant, named after a guy named Davis. Quadrant because it measures 90 degrees. This is a very clever device. Instead of having to look at the sun, the user is looking at a shadow of the sun. So we see on the left side of the implement a small arc which covers about 60 degrees. It's marked, calibrated, and the object in the center of that, let's see if I can point here for a second. Not having a lot of success. Oops, back, sorry. The object in the center on the left arc is movable. You would set that at approximately, magic, okay. We'll move this, slide it up and down to my estimated latitude. I know, more or less where I am. I'm gonna say I'm sort of near 30 degrees. I'll put that at 30 degrees latitude. And then I'm going to hold it so that as we see on the right, the sun rays are going across the top of that and casting a shadow, which falls right on the bottom of this little slit through which I'm going to look at the horizon. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to slide this little piece here up and down until I can look through that and see that shadow lined up perfectly with the slit. What this does is it gives me actually 2 angular measurements. My estimated measurement here and my other measurement here. I'm going to add the 2 together. And this is kind of a precursor of the vernier scale, vernier caliper, which allows very precise measurements because this arc, which is smaller, actually covers a larger portion of a circle. It covers 60 degrees. This larger arc only covers 30 degrees. So the increments are going to be much larger on here, allowing more precise measurements. Okay, so the next invention coming about 150 years later were the octant, shown on the upper right, which is actually an eighth of a circle, 45 degrees, but it allows measurements by magic of 90 degrees. The sextant, having a 60-degree arc, allowed measurements of 120 degrees. Now you might ask, why do we want to measure more than 90 degrees? And that's because in certain occasions, instead of measuring the height of one body above the horizon, they would measure the distance, angular distance between 2 bodies in the sky. And that's where the sextant had the advantage of being able to measure more than 90 degrees. That was necessary in early calculations of longitude, but once we came to the better solution, which we'll discuss shortly, the octant was really just as good as the sextant, and it kind of stayed in common use for 100 years or more because it was easier to make. It had a frame of wood and less complicated. The sextant, on the other hand, was made out of all brass, and it was more complicated in what it could do. On both of these, you'll see a mirror, and the mirror would reflect the image of the sun or the star onto a horizon glass, which would be lined up with the horizon. But even if you're looking at the sun in a mirror, it's obviously going to be bright. So we have a series of filters here, which would allow you to look directly at a reflection of the sun. On the bottom right, as an example, we had a partial solar eclipse in August of 2017. I went out in my backyard. I lined up the filters on my sextant and took a photograph of the sun. If I had been looking at the sun, you see behind this, the sky is still very bright, even though the sun is 2/3 covered. If I had looked at the sun, I would have been completely blinded. So this was a very useful series of technological advancements. But what can the sun tell us? Why do we want to look at this? It's always moving, right? Yes, but its position in the sky is predictable. We see here a series of pictures showing the sun rotate, or the Earth rotating around the sun, revolving around the sun over the period of a year. And we see on the left that the axis of the Earth is actually tilted at 23.5 degrees approximately to the plane of rotation around the sun. That's a critical number. Remember 23.5 degrees for a minute or two. But we see here on the left, there's the Earth, and it's the winter solstice. Actually, more correctly, the summer or the December solstice, because that's the summer solstice for the people in Australia and the Southern Hemisphere. But the axis is tilted at 23.5 degrees. So the Northern Hemisphere is kind of pointing away from the sun. They have the shortest days of the year and so forth. And we get around to the opposite side, the summer solstice. The North Pole is pointed as exactly to the sun as it does of any day of the year. We have the longest days of the year. In between, we have two equinoxes in which the sun is directly overhead at the equator, and days all over the Earth are pretty much exactly 12 hours long. Well, where do we go from this? Well, let's look at this illustration on the bottom. Remember, 23.5 degrees. We see here the Arctic Circle. On the December solstice, it gets no sunlight. The sun never rises anywhere in between that mark. Well, because of the angle of 23.5 degrees, that is in fact 23.5 degrees south of the North Pole. The Arctic Circle, therefore the latitude is 90 minus 23.5, gives us 66.5 degrees north. We then see the equator, but here, the Tropic of Capricorn, that is the point at which the sun's rays are going to be directly overhead on the December solstice. That is 23.5 degrees south of the equator. Aha, we start to see some things happening here. The South Pole, the sun never sets on that December solstice, and that is 23.5 degrees above the South Pole, or 66.5 degrees south. So what does this tell us? Well, we know on this particular day, if the sun happens to be directly overhead, we know we are on the Tropic of Capricorn. Well, the sun's probably not directly overhead where we are, but we can figure the difference between where it is and use that to calculate our position. Oops, wrong direction, sorry about that. Okay, here, I didn't have a good illustration of this, but we see the arrow on the left. This is now, if this were up on the summer solstice and the sun is pointing from that direction, the sun is now directly overhead at the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator. So we have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. In between, we have an area of 47 degrees, which we call the tropics. That's the area in which the sun is always overhead, at least directly overhead, at least one day of the year. And similarly, we have other points on here that we can identify the altitude or the the latitude of those points by where the sun appears. So what do we do with this? Well, we determine latitude from the solar altitude. We measure the solar altitude at noon. We determine that through multiple observations as noon is approaching, and when it reaches its zenith, we note the time and the altitude, and then we simply add or subtract the sun's declination, the difference that the sun is on that day apart from the equator. Again, it's easy on the equinoxes, it's at the equator. At the solstices, it's at the tropics. In between, you'd think we could kind of interpolate and just figure out where we are. Yes, we could, and come up with a fairly accurate measurement. But somebody came up with this handy dandy thing, the analemma. And the analemma is something which shows us the position of the sun in relation to the Earth's surface on every day of the year. So we can use this more exactly to look at the particular day along the line of the analemma. We can figure out where the sun is going to be, and we can use that as the adjustment to our observation to determine our latitude. Or we can have a nautical almanac, which provides us tables which do the same thing. While I'm here, I should also note that this shows the equation of time. In fact, as the Earth goes around the sun, its orbit is not perfectly circular. So therefore, on certain times of the year, the solar time, as we see, for example, on a sundial, will differ slightly from the time that we keep on our clocks, plus or minus a few minutes. But again, that's something we can calculate. Well, what about longitude? Well, there is no east star or west star because the Earth is always rotating, so we got a harder problem here. To determine longitude, we have to know the exact time. And if we have an error in our calculation of 1 minute, that's going to give us a 15-mile error. And in the days of where the only timekeeper on the ship was a 30-minute sand glass, this is certainly a significant opportunity to have significant errors in time. The only time they knew accurately was local apparent noon, that time when the sun could be measured at its highest point in the sky. We needed a clock. Well, the original clocks being sundials and sand glasses, sundials certainly not going to be accurate on a bouncing ship. And if the sun's, well, let's leave it at that. The first actual clocks were water driven. And as the water is sloshing around on your bouncing ship, that's not going to work very well. Weight driven clocks, similar to a cuckoo clock, if those weights are bouncing around on the moving ship, not going to work very well. Spring driven clocks came in around the middle of the 15th century. You'd think that might be the solution, but the early clocks had problems with the metal in the spring being prone to expansion and contraction by changes in temperature. The humidity would affect the clock, and the movement of the ship wasn't kind either. Pendulum clocks invented in 1656, like the old grandfather clock, the later versions were accurate within about 1 minute a day, not too bad, but again, the moving of a pendulum would not work on a ship. So none of these would work on a ship. Well, the English government, with its proud navy, decided we need to be able to know the exact time at sea so we can calculate longitude. And just kind of keep that thought in your mind, we'll get back to that. But they offered a 20,000 pound prize for anyone who could come up with a clock which, after a trip from England to the West Indies, would be able to calculate longitude within 30 miles, and it could have no more than 3 seconds of gain or loss per day. Well, a gentleman named John Harrison in England, after 25 years of trying, finally in 1761, came up with a clock that in fact only lost 5 seconds on the entire outward bound voyage and back to England. Matter of fact, people were so skeptical they thought it might have been a fluke. They only gave him a small portion of the prize and told him he had to reproduce the act, which he did. So he got eventually the full prize, but it was a very cumbersome, complicated, expensive machine. And it took the French a few more years to figure out how to simplify it, but retain the accuracy. But by around 1766, accurate clocks became available, chronometers, which could be taken on ships, like the compasses. They were mounted on gimbals, and they were very sturdy, protected from the weather, and very accurate. What does this do for us? Well, now, all of a sudden, we can determine longitude very easily. The Earth is rotating one full turn, that's 360 degrees, in 24 hours. Therefore, it moves 1 degree in 1/360th of a day, which is 4 minutes. To calculate your longitude, all you need to do is work out the time difference between your position and noon at the prime meridian. You've got noon at the prime meridian on your chronometer. At local apparent noon where you are, I'll see that the chronometer says 4:25 Greenwich Mean Time. I will take my sun measurement and I will note the time, and I will determine that it's 4 hours and 25 minutes different from Greenwich where I am. And converted to minutes, that means I'm 265 minutes away from Greenwich. I divide by 4 minutes per degree, and that gives me a figure of 66.25. My longitude is 66.25 degrees, or 66 degrees, 15 minutes west longitude. Actually, an extraordinarily simple calculation, as long as I know the correct time. By knowing what time it is, I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'll measure the sun's altitude. I need to measure it at its zenith, which tells me when noon is, but it also then gives me a line for latitude. I'll plot that on my chart. And the act of plotting that, I figured out what time was noon, which allows me to do a quick calculation and plot the longitude, and voila, there you are. It's actually quite a simple process. Knowing the exact time also allows us to find an accurate position at night without having to look at the sun. At any particular time, if you think about it, a heavenly body will be directly overhead at some place on the Earth. Over time, a lot of people have done a lot of observations. There's a fellow by the name of Tycho Brahe in the 1500s who spent his entire life just keeping records of where different stars and planets were at different times on different nights. He had the same kind of instruments we're talking about. He used an astrolabe, except his astrolabe was about 10 feet in diameter, which allowed very precise measurements. And that's all he did for 30 or 40 years was collect data. And that allowed people coming after him to have a huge database from which they could start calculating and develop tables, which become quite extensive. And we can then say for a particular body, where is it going to be overhead at any given time? And then if I can measure 2 of those, we see here a circle. The blue circle shows for a particular line of position for the moon. On this particular observation, the height of the moon indicates that I'm somewhere along that circle. The height of the sun indicates I'm somewhere along that second circle. Therefore, I must be at one of the 2 points of intersection. Hopefully, I know I'm in the North Atlantic and not the deep South Atlantic. But I could fix that by having a third line from a third heavenly body, would take away any ambiguity, and that tells me where I am. Now, it's not as complicated as it is. Yes, I have looked at lots of texts on celestial navigation. I had to read them and use them once upon a time, and they tend to make the subject much more complicated than it really needs to be. They bury it in geometric formula, complete with Greek letters and all kinds of esoteric terminology that makes it hard for the layman to grasp what's going on. The illustration on the bottom right is taken from basically The Idiot's Guide to Celestial Navigation. It's supposed to be simple. It's anything but. And that's all well and good. If you want to have an accurate fix, let's say within a mile, which is about the best we can achieve with celestial navigation, which you do by applying all kinds of corrections. You correct your readings for how high above the horizon is your eye. You then add corrections for, did you look at the bottom of the sun or the top of the sun? You add corrections for the time difference between your observation of 2 or 3 planets. And again, you can come within a mile. But for most of us, and for the early explorers, plus or minus 10 miles is perfectly good. Think about that. If you leave Chesapeake Bay and you steam or sail east across the Atlantic for a long way, and then you determine to come back, if you can find your latitude within 10 or 15 miles, you're going to be within sight of Chesapeake Bay when you make your returning landfall. So not a problem. And actually, as I've shown you, quite simple to obtain without having to know a whole lot about the theory and without having to do a whole lot of very complicated calculations. And then, of course, came electronics. The early 20th century brought radio beacons and radio direction finders, and World War II brought us radar and fathometers. Fathometers, why do we care about that? Well, if we have a good chart of the depth in the ocean bottom, that gives us another line, basically, that we can use to determine our position. LORAN, A and C, and other electronic systems that came later, a whole flurry of different systems. And after a while, celestial navigation became almost unnecessary. It became kind of the backup. And then GPS. 20 years ago or so, GPS started to become widespread. And the older electronic systems, acknowledging that GPS was more accurate and easier to use, were largely phased out. And we got to the point where celestial navigation was pretty much no longer taught. It was not taught in the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, the Merchant Marine Academy, and I'm guessing the Air Force Academy. And then one day somebody noticed, gee, GPS as our sole purpose, our system for finding where we are, is vulnerable to all kinds of things. Unfriendly actions, hacking, jamming, electromagnetic pulses, physical destruction, not to mention natural occurrences such as solar flares, and who knows what else. And with that realization, a decade or so ago, the service academies, I know, and I don't know who else, but began, again, teaching at least the basics of celestial navigation. So that gives us kind of a quick run through how people have found their way through time. Very simple celestial navigation combined with keen observation of the conditions around and an understanding of, basic understanding of how things move in the sky allowed navigators to do some remarkable, precise navigation over a long period of time. So I'll come back and end with Sir Cloudesley Shovel, lovely looking fellow, isn't he? Who reminds us that whatever we are using to find our position, we need to have a general awareness of where we are. And when we start to get close to something where precise navigation is important, that's where piloting skills come in. And with that, I think I'm done.
All right, great. So we have a couple of questions. One question here is, how did they measure the sun when it was obscured or weather was bad?
Well, that's certainly a good point. The answer is they didn't. And that's a limitation on this whole system. If you are steaming through 3 or 4 days of clouds, that's where dead reckoning becomes very important. You know where you were on your last good fix, and for several days, quite possibly, especially in the North Atlantic, you're going to have to depend on moving your position forward based on your estimated course and speed. So that was a problem. Again, that was why the compass was important, because if you couldn't see Polaris to determine north, the compass allowed you at least to steer a line of direction when the weather obscured the skies.
Great. So another question here, why do you think European societies produced many of these innovations in navigation when the Chinese and other non-European societies had a head start? Well, does that have something to do with the commerce around the Mediterranean?
Yes and no, and somewhere in between. Most of these innovations were in fact borrowed from somebody else. The compass was developed by the Chinese, who first used it for navigation. And it was then adapted and improved by Europeans. The astrolabe was invented by the Greeks, who, the technology was lost and recovered by the Arab traders who were pretty much operating in the Mediterranean along the north coast of Africa. The truth is, other people were in fact developing technologies kind of parallel, and I don't know. I have sort of a Eurocentric focus, I guess, on the subject. But as I pointed out, the Polynesians, without any high technology at all, were very skilled, precise navigators. So this is really a focus on European technology because that's what we tend to look at as we look at seagoing history.
Yeah, it truly was a iterative development with a lot of people involved over many, many years then.
A lot of these things were actually probably independently, simultaneously developed, like the idea of a boat. We found dugout canoes on just about every continent of the world. It's not likely that somebody went around from continent to continent giving dugout canoe lessons. It's much more likely that somebody discovered that the log he was riding would work better if he hollowed out the top of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. So that looks like all the questions. Let's just double check to see if anybody has a raised hand, which nobody seems to have a raised hand at the moment. So I think you did a good job of preemptively answering everybody's questions.
Well, I hope so. And I appreciate everybody tuning in today, and hope we'll see you again at future broadcasts.
All right. Everybody have a nice day, and we'll see you later.